Today's video is brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one platform for building a beautiful website and growing your online presence. More details on them later in today's video. Jerry Seinfeld called Richard Pryor the Picasso of our profession. Both Comedy Central and Rolling Stone magazine ranked him as the greatest stand-up comic of all time. He was the first person ever to be awarded the Mark Twain Prize for American Humor. And if we were to mention all of the accolades and accomplishments that he had ever received, we'd be here all day. All you need to know is that when it comes to comedy, Richard Pryor was the man. When it came to everything else, though, he was just as flawed and as weak as everybody else. From a deeply atypical, sometimes traumatizing childhood to an adulthood dominated by vices and addiction, today we're going to be taking a candid look at the life of one of the funniest people to ever pick up a microphone. Richard Franklin Lennox Thomas Pryor was born on December 1st, 1940 at St. Francis Hospital in Peoria, Illinois, the son of Leroy Buck Pryor and Gertrude Thomas. To say that Richard Pryor didn't get to live a fun, happy and carefree childhood would be the understatement of the century. For starters, he was part of a black family in the mid-20th century in Illinois. That alone was enough to make life the complete opposite of fun, happy and carefree. Black people had a curfew. Only a handful of businesses in town would serve them, and half of the black population was unemployed, while the other half could only find menial jobs like working in a slaughterhouse or driving trucks. Then, of course, there was the looming threat of violence and lynchings that represented a ubiquitous threat in their lives. Richard Pryor grew up in a brothel, owned and operated by his grandmother, Marie Carter Pryor, where his mother worked as a prostitute and his father as a pimp/enforcer. His grandmother, whom Richard simply called Mama, was the one who looked after him most of the time and was the primary influence in his early life. That being said, Pryor made it clear that Marie Carter was a tough, no-nonsense woman, a survivor who endured more than her fair share of hardships in her own life, and tough love was the only kind of love you were getting with her. Pryor described his grandmother as a large sunflower, big, strong, bright, appealing, but was also a mean, tough, controlling. From a young age, Richard was exposed to the harsh realities of life in a very graphic and uncensored way. His grandma made him wise to all the injustices and prejudices he would endure due to the color of his skin, while his parents never really hid the fact that they never wanted him. But it could have been a lot worse, Pryor later opined. When he was a kid, he once found a dead baby in a shoebox, so at least he was content that that wasn't his fate. That's just one grisly example of the things that young Richard witnessed firsthand that would have traumatized most other people. When Richard was born, his parents were not married yet. They did get married a few years later in 1943 after his father got drafted by the army, but it wasn't exactly what you'd call a fairy tale marriage. Buck Pryor was not made for military life, and he was sent home after just 7 months with a Section 8 discharge. Back in Peoria, his relationship with his new wife was tempestuous, often violent, and in 1946, Gertrude Thomas took 5-year-old Richard and left her husband, going to live with her parents in Springfield, Illinois. She filed for divorce that same year, citing extreme and repeated cruelty, but the judge sided with the father since Gertrude had a history of running away and granted Buck Pryor full custody of Richard, thus sending him back to the brothel in Peoria. Since real life didn't offer up too many rays of sunshine and rainbows, unsurprisingly, young Richard sought comfort in the world of fantasy. He would sneak into cinemas in town and pretend he was the heroes that he saw on screen. Pryor was inspired by men like Kirk Douglas, John Wayne, and Boris Karloff, although, oddly enough, his favorite cinematic hero was a Western actor named Lash LaRue, who always wore black from head to toe and used a whip instead of a pistol. Then during the early 50s, Richard started gravitating towards comedy after he saw his first Jerry Lewis movie. Around the same time, he was forced to leave the neighborhood that he grew up in after it was torn down to build a bridge. This meant living someplace else and going to a new school, the predominantly white Blaine Sumner Elementary. Suffice to say that Richard was out of his comfort zone, but he took a page out of Jerry Lewis's book and started imitating his clumsy, childlike persona. The other kids found it funny. His teacher found it funny too, and even began giving him 10 minutes every Friday afternoon to perform his new routines. By becoming the class clown, Richard Pryor found acceptance from his peers for the first time in his life and got his first taste of success as a performer. Richard's amateur comedy career continued into high school. He briefly joined the Youth Theatre Guild at the Carver Community Centre in Peoria, where he met future playwright and civil rights activist Juliet Whittaker, who encouraged him to pursue his passion. Inspired by her, Richard started developing his own characters. His favourite was the Rummage Sale Ranger, who was a black superhero who was too poor to buy his own stuff and instead had to wear whatever he found at rummage sales, like women's tights and shoes that were too big. But, you know what they say, everybody's a critic. One day, the science teacher, Mr. Fink, was fed up with Richard distracting all the other kids at the back of the class. Fink grabbed him by the scruff of the neck, and Pryor took a swing at him and was expelled immediately. Now that he was a high school dropout, Richard needed to find work. For the next couple of years, he drifted in and out of employment in a series of dead-end jobs. Janitor, shoe shine boy, delivery boy, factory hands, none of them lasted long. In 1958, Pryor did something he soon came to regret. In his hasty pursuit of adventure, he enlisted in the army. All of a sudden, the 18-year-old kid who had never left Illinois found himself across the ocean in Germany, yet the environment was woefully familiar. Pryor's commanding officers were all racist Southerners, and the military brass in Germany felt like it might well have been smack dab in the middle of Mississippi. Inevitably, racial tensions erupted into a fight, during which Pryor stabbed a white soldier in the back. He was arrested, but in a moment of harmonious serendipity, the base commander was just getting ready to retire. He didn't want to deal with all the extra paperwork over some fight between GIs, so he just sent Pryor home to Illinois. Back in Peoria, Richard took a few big steps in his life. In 1960, he met and married Patricia Price, the first of 7 marriages for Pryor, with each one only lasting a few years. He also decided to make a go of it as an entertainer. He reached out to a few friends who ran nightclubs and got some experience in front of a live audience. Once Pryor felt that his material was good enough, he decided it was time to go big or go home. He packed up his bags and headed for New York City. Success in the Big Apple came surprisingly swiftly. Pryor was completely unknown in these parts, so he decided that he could be anyone he wanted. Instead of the real Richard, who grew up in a dysfunctional environment, to say the least, he was a clean-cut, soft-spoken high school graduate and former sports star. He modeled his persona on another black comedian who was making waves at the time, Bill Cosby. Unlike the real Cosby that we know and hate today, early Cosby portrayed himself as an affable guy who appealed to all audiences by relying on safe and clean universal comedy with no racial elements. Using the same approach, Pryor became a mainstay at several comedy clubs pretty fast. Within the year, he made his television debut on a variety show called On Broadway Tonight. In the years that followed, Pryor scored appearances on major TV shows like The Ed Sullivan Show, The Tonight Show, The Kraft Musical, and The Merv Griffin Show. In 1967, he even made his film debut with a small role in the comedy The Busybody. But more and more, Pryor felt that there was a disconnect between the friendly and lovable comic that saw people on television and the real Richard Pryor, the one who was angry over all of the crap that he had to endure in his life, the one who liked to get high and get laid whenever possible, the one who wanted to sucker punch America in the gut when it expected to be tickled in the ribs. In his own words, Pryor felt there was a world of junkies and winos, pool hustlers and prostitutes screaming inside his head, trying to be heard. The longer he kept them bottled up, the harder they tried to escape. And inevitably, escape they did, turning Richard Pryor into one of the most profane but also profound voices in the history of comedy. The sponsor of today's video is one of my absolute favorites. If you've ever wanted to start a website but have been put off by the sort of complicated coding, then Squarespace is perfect for you. Building an online presence can be incredibly daunting, but no longer is an advanced coding degree or small fortune required to get started. Squarespace helps you stand out with a beautiful website built using their easy drag and drop method. Their platform also provides you with powerful analytics and insights into who visits your site and how they interact with your content. Squarespace's analytics tools include page views, traffic sources, audience geography, and more. Figure out what is drawing your audience in and capitalize on that premium data that's provided to you. The Squarespace members area feature also makes it easy for you to monetize your content in a way that fits with your brand. Unlock a new revenue stream for your business and sell exclusive access to gated content for your most dedicated customers. And Squarespace allows you to integrate email campaigns into your website as well. Convert your email subscribers into loyal customers with their huge selection of email templates and automation features. Test out their platform and its features before making any commitments. You can go to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch your website, go to squarespace.com/biographics to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. And now back to today's video. It was September 1967, and Richard Pryor was booked for a run at the Aladdin Hotel in Las Vegas. By this point, he had established himself firmly in the comedy world, and sold-out crowds had become the norm for him, although they were all coming to see a persona of Richard Pryor that didn't actually exist in real life. Maybe it was all the pent-up frustrations, maybe it was the drugs or the anxiety, but as soon as Pryor stepped on stage, he saw Dean Martin at one of the front tables staring at him. So was everyone else in the audience, and they all eagerly anticipated for the comedian to say something. Pryor described this experience as an epiphany, and after a few long moments of silence, he blurted out in front of the crowd, "What the f*** am I doing here?" Then he turned around and walked off stage, muttering to himself, and later he received a very angry call from his manager, who warned him that he'd never work in Vegas again. Afterward, the facade that Pryor had built for himself for the sake of his career slowly started to come down. For the first time ever, he was re-examining all the experiences he had had in Peoria, but this time not as a kid who was too young to understand what was really happening, but as a man who was ready to present his life to the public, raw, uncensored, and uncut. And people found it funny. The comedian recorded his first comedy album in 1968, simply titled Richard Pryor, and it was followed by 20 more over the course of his career, 5 of which won the Grammy for Best Comedy Album. But this new Richard Pryor was also a man who indulged in his vices without a care in the world, which in this case meant drugs, booze, and women. He partied with the likes of Miles Davis and Paul Mooney. It wasn't uncommon for him to spend all night in a club with Red Fox, battling each other for the attention of a sexy waitress, listening to jazz and snorting cocaine by the spoonful. This behavior took a toll on Richard's personal life. By 1970, his second marriage had already fallen apart. The money that Pryor was not spending on alimony payments, he either smoked it or shot it straight up his nose. He also had to deal with 2 family tragedies in quick succession when his stepmother and his father died less than a year apart. But professionally, Pryor was experiencing the greatest success of his life. His third album became a breakthrough hit that sold well, won a Grammy, and propelled Pryor into comedy stardom. His next 2 albums also won Grammys, giving Pryor a rare three-peat as one of only 4 people to win it 3 years in a row. He wrote for multiple hit television shows during the first half of the 70s and even won an Emmy in 1974 as a co-writer for a Lily Tomlin special. Pryor appeared on the first season of Saturday Night Live, becoming the first black person to host it, and unsurprisingly, the episode also happened to feature one of the most controversial skits in the show's near 50-year history, where a word association game between Pryor and Chevy Chase quickly turned into a tension-filled contest of racial epithets. Briefly, the comedian was given his own variety show in 1977, The Richard Pryor Show, which was cancelled after only 4 episodes due to his unflinching unwillingness to tone down his material. His acting star was also on the rise, as Pryor appeared in over a dozen movies during the decade. Worth mentioning here is the buddy comedy Silver Streak, which marked Richard Pryor's first on-screen pairing with Gene Wilder, as the duo went on to make 3 more movies together. Pryor's fast-living hedonistic lifestyle was not without consequences. The 70s saw the beginning and end of his third marriage. At one point, Pryor was even arrested and charged with assault with a deadly weapon for shooting up his wife's car during an argument. She wasn't in it at the time, and the charges were later dropped, but the divorce came soon after. In 1977, Pryor suffered his first heart attack due to all of the drugs and alcohol. But for the first time, his party habits also affected him professionally. In 1974, Pryor lost out on what would have probably been the biggest movie role of his career. It was certainly the biggest one of the decade. He helped co-write Blazing Saddles with Mel Brooks, a satirical western which is now preserved in the Library of Congress and has been ranked by the American Film Institute as the 6th best comedy in American cinema. Brooks wanted Richard Pryor for the lead alongside Gene Wilder, but the studio put the kibosh on the idea, considering Pryor too much of a wild card due to his drug use. This wouldn't be the last role that Pryor would miss out on, but it became the biggest what if of his professional career. The following decade continued the same mixed bag of highs and lows for Richard Pryor, with the lows typically coming as a result of his unchecked vices. The year 1980 is a perfect example of this. Pryor began the decade by starring in the major hit Stir Crazy, once again alongside Gene Wilder, which was directed by Sidney Poitier and became the first movie from a black director to gross over $100 million, made even more impressive by the fact that it was R-rated. We'd say that counts as a pretty lofty high, which was immediately brought down when Pryor almost killed himself by setting himself on fire. On June the 10th, 1980, the comedian was admitted to the hospital in critical condition with severe burns over half his body. This was after he was spotted running down the streets of Los Angeles on fire. For years, the story was that Pryor had set himself ablaze from an accidental explosion while freebasing cocaine. Only later did he reveal that he intentionally set himself on fire during a drug-induced psychosis and that he doused himself in liquor and flicked on a lighter. After that, once more came the high. Following weeks of excruciating rehab in the hospital, Pryor moved to Hawaii for some peace and quiet. He got clean, trading in the drugs for fruit juice, scenic landscapes, growing orchids, and learning to fly a plane. He even used his Inferno fiasco as material for his next comedy show. This was called Live on the Sunset Strip, and it was another Grammy-winning effort that was accompanied by Pryor's most successful concert film. But this new and improved Richard Pryor was not around for long. Once he was back in LA, it only took him until he found one of his secret stashes before he started getting high again. Even a few more close calls did nothing to deter him. On March the 4th, 1982, actor John Belushi came around the Comedy Store looking for Pryor to go out partying, but he couldn't find him, so instead he ended up alone at the Chateau Marmont that night, where he died of a cocaine overdose the following morning. Then a while later, while filming The Toy alongside Jackie Gleason in Louisiana, Pryor's heart started pounding so hard that he had to be rushed to the hospital. Speaking of The Toy, Pryor's acting credits during the 1980s were nothing worth writing home about. He eventually realized that Hollywood's formulaic slop usually performed better at the box office than anything worthwhile, so most of his roles became nothing but paychecks for him. This culminated with Superman 3, where Pryor was paid $4 million to play an evil henchman, not only a record for a black actor at the time, but also reportedly more than the lead actor, Christopher Reeve, was paid. Pryor had one attempt at cinematic creativity with Jojo Dancy or Life is Calling in 1986, representing Pryor's only directorial effort. It was a biographical comedy drama, which he also co-wrote and starred in, but it was a flop at the box office, which only reinforced Pryor's beliefs that he was better off starring in generic and mindless crap. 1986 was a year that changed Richard Pryor's life forever. He noticed that he was losing a lot of weight. His eyesight was getting worse. Sometimes he would lose his balance and fall to the ground for no apparent reason. He feared that he might have AIDS, but he got tested and it came back negative. Something was definitely wrong though, so he went to the Mayo Clinic to get a bunch of tests done, and the result was devastating. Richard Pryor had multiple sclerosis. Even though it was in its infancy, he knew that the disease was unpredictable and the symptoms were only likely going to get worse. But just because Pryor had MS did not mean that all of his other health problems caused by decades of decadence and debauchery simply went away. In 1990, he suffered his second heart attack, ironically after getting clean at the Betty Ford Center. Then, one day while he was filming Another You, his last movie with Gene Wilder, Pryor woke up and his legs simply wouldn't move. His ability to walk still came and went at this time, but that was the day that Pryor realized that MS took over. For a man who used to party with the best of them, Pryor now had to resign himself to life in the slow lane, hopefully with no more surprises. But even tragedy afforded Pryor the occasion for levity every now and then. One morning in 1992, the news reported that Richard Pryor had died when, in fact, he was sleeping in his bedroom. This prompted his panicked housekeeper to enter the room and make a lot of noise. At first, Pryor offered no response, but he woke up screaming after the housekeeper pinched his toe to check if he was still alive. The startled woman explained that she thought he was dead because he was lying on the bed with his eyes closed, not hardly moving, to which Pryor replied, "That's how I sleep. How do you do it?" The same year, Pryor wrote new comedy material and performed a concert for the first time in almost 6 years. He couldn't stand up anymore and he had to sit in an easy chair for the duration of the show, but the night was a hit and Pryor hoped that he could go on tour again. However, just a few more gigs sapped him of all the strength that he had and he had to cancel the rest of the tour, realizing that he had more heart than energy. This failure destroyed him emotionally, and from that moment on, the comedian decided that he had no choice but to step out of the limelight. During the 90s, Pryor only made a handful of TV and movie appearances. A highlight was a guest spot on the medical drama Chicago Hope, where he played a bitter patient with MS and actually secured an Emmy nomination for his final worthwhile performance as an actor. Pryor's fourth wife, Jennifer Lee, returned to him and acted as his caretaker. The two got married again in 2001, and she stood by his side until December 10th, 2005, when Richard Pryor died of a heart attack at the age of 65.